The night the laughter softened. The studio lights above Burbank's stage, one had a way of making everything look brighter than it really was. They washed over the polished floor, bounced off the brass instruments resting beside the bandstand, and settled gently across the familiar desk where so many conversations had begun with laughter. For decades, that room had been a place where tension dissolved into jokes, where celebrities arrived polished and confident, and where the host, calm, composed, and famously unshakable, guided every moment with quiet control. On most nights, the air carried the warm rhythm of applause and the comfortable promise that whatever happened next would be entertaining, harmless, easy. But this night did not feel easy. There was something different in the quiet that settled before the next guest was announced. It was not the usual expectant hush of a television audience waiting for a famous entrance. It was softer, more careful, almost protective, as if the people sitting in those rows understood, without being told, that what they were about to witness might require gentleness instead of laughter. Behind the curtain, Dean Martin waited. For years, his entrances had been effortless. He was known for that relaxed smile, the slightly tilted posture, the sense that nothing in the world could truly trouble him. Audiences had loved that version of him, the man who could turn a simple line into music, who could make a room feel warmer just by standing in it. His voice, smooth and familiar, had been part of countless evenings in living rooms across America. To many, he was not just an entertainer. He was a comforting presence, a reminder of simpler nights filled with song and humor. Yet as he stood there now, the easy confidence people remembered seemed quieter, more distant. He adjusted his jacket slowly, almost thoughtfully, as though each movement required more intention than it once had. The years had added weight to his posture, not just the kind that comes with age, but the heavier, invisible kind carried in silence. On the other side of the curtain, Johnny Carson sat at his desk, listening to the band finish the previous segment. He had spent most of his career mastering the art of composure. Presidents, actors, comedians, he had interviewed them all with the same steady rhythm, balancing humor with respect. Viewers trusted him because he rarely allowed his emotions to spill beyond the careful boundary he kept between himself and the audience. But tonight, even Johnny felt the shift in the room. He glanced toward the curtain, knowing who would walk through it next, and for a brief moment, his usual calm expression softened into something more personal, something closer to concern than anticipation. Their history stretched back years, built not only on television appearances, but on shared moments after the cameras stopped. Conversations that were never recorded, phone calls that had nothing to do with ratings or schedules. The kind of quiet friendship that forms between people who understand the strange pressure of living in public while trying to protect a private life. When the announcer finally spoke Dean Martin's name, the applause that followed was warm, but restrained, almost respectful in its tone. It was not the explosive cheer that usually greeted beloved performers. Instead, it sounded like something closer to welcome, gentle, patient, understanding. Dean stepped onto the stage. For a moment, the lights seemed too bright. He paused just slightly, barely noticeable unless someone was watching carefully, before continuing forward. His smile appeared, familiar but softer than the one audiences remembered from earlier years. It was still kind, still gracious, but it carried a quiet distance, as though part of him remained somewhere else entirely. Johnny rose to greet him, extending his hand. Their handshake lingered a second longer than usual, not awkwardly, but meaningfully. Two old friends acknowledging something unspoken. They sat. The band eased into silence, and Johnny began with the kind of opening he had used thousands of times before, light, conversational, safe. He asked about music, about memories from earlier days, about stories audiences loved to hear again. Dean responded politely, even offering a small joke that earned a gentle ripple of laughter. For a few minutes, it almost felt like any other appearance. Almost. Because beneath the familiar rhythm, there was a noticeable stillness in Dean's voice. The effortless charm remained, but it no longer floated freely. It moved more carefully, like someone choosing each word with intention rather than instinct. His hands rested quietly in his lap instead of gesturing as they once had. His gaze, though attentive, sometimes drifted, not away from the conversation, but inward, as if part of his attention was turned toward something only he could see. Johnny noticed. He had spent decades reading people across that desk, sensing when a guest wanted to joke, when they needed space, when a subject should be changed. Tonight, the signals were different, not dramatic, not obvious, just subtle enough that only someone who truly knew Dean might recognize them. So Johnny adjusted. He slowed the pace of the conversation, allowing pauses that would normally be filled with humor. He let Dean speak without interruption, nodding more than usual, offering small words of encouragement instead of punchlines. It was the kind of shift most viewers wouldn't consciously notice, but it changed the atmosphere of the interview from performance to conversation. And gradually, the room followed that chain. The audience laughed less, listened more. Even the band members, accustomed to jumping in with musical stings, remained still, sensing that this moment required quiet rather than energy. Dean spoke about the past, about long nights on the road, about friendships formed in dressing rooms and backstage corridors, about the strange experience of being recognized everywhere while still trying to live an ordinary life at home. His voice carried warmth when he mentioned old colleagues, especially those who had shared the earliest, hardest years before success arrived. There was dignity in the way he told those stories, not nostalgia for fame, but appreciation for the people who had stood beside him when everything was uncertain. At one point, Johnny asked a simple question about what he enjoyed most these days: music, time with family, or simply rest. Dean paused. It was not a long pause, only a few seconds. But in a live television studio, even a brief silence can feel significant. He exhaled slowly, offering a small, thoughtful smile before answering that sometimes the best moments were the quiet ones. Early mornings, evenings without schedules, time where nothing was expected. The way he said it carried more meaning than the words themselves. Johnny leaned back slightly, giving him space. For years, viewers had known Dean Martin as the embodiment of ease, the man who never seemed rushed, never seemed troubled. Yet tonight, that ease felt different. It was no longer the carefree charm of a performer. It was something deeper, shaped by experience, by loss, by the quiet understanding that life eventually changes every rhythm we once relied on. And perhaps that was why he looked different. Not because the smile was gone. It was still there, gentle and sincere. But because it no longer hid the truth that time leaves its marks on everyone, even those who once seemed untouchable. As the conversation continued, Johnny chose not to push toward anything too personal. Instead, he honored the moment by keeping it simple, two men talking, not as host and guest, but as friends who understood that sometimes presence is more valuable than performance. The audience sensed it too. No one shifted in their seats. No restless coughs or whispered side comments broke the stillness. They were witnessing something rare for television, not drama, not spectacle, but quiet honesty. Near the end of the segment, Johnny thanked Dean for coming, his voice carrying a warmth that extended beyond professional courtesy. Dean nodded, offering a modest shrug as if to say it wasn't a big gesture, even though everyone in the room could feel that it was. When Dean stood to leave, the applause rose again, this time stronger but still respectful. It wasn't the cheer reserved for a dazzling performance. It was something steadier, almost grateful. He paused briefly before stepping off stage, turning back with that familiar half-smile, one that had comforted audiences for decades. And in that moment, it became clear why he seemed different that night. Not because he had lost who he was, but because the world was finally seeing the part of him that had always been there, the quieter, more human side that fame could never fully hide. The lights remained bright, the band prepared for the next segment. The show continued as television always does. Yet for those who sat in that studio, and for those watching from their living rooms, something subtle had shifted. They had come expecting entertainment. Instead, they had witnessed presence, dignity, and the quiet strength it takes simply to show up when life has grown heavier than anyone else can see. And long after the laughter returned to the stage on other nights, many would remember this one, not for jokes or stories, but for the moment when a legendary performer reminded everyone that behind every public smile is a private life shaped by love, memory, and the passage of time. The weight behind the smile. Long before that quiet evening under the studio lights, the version of Dean Martin the world believed it knew had been carefully shaped by years of performance, expectation, and the quiet discipline required to survive in an industry that rarely allowed anyone to be fully human. Audiences remembered the easy grin, the relaxed posture, the gentle humor that made every appearance feel effortless, Yet the truth behind that image was built from decades of work that began far from Hollywood's polished stages. As a young man growing up in a modest immigrant household, he had learned early that survival depended not on charm, but on persistence, and that lesson stayed with him long after the tuxedos and orchestras became part of his daily life. Even at the height of his success, when crowds filled theaters just to hear him sing a single line, there remained within him the quiet awareness of how fragile everything could be, how quickly applause could fade, and how easily the world could forget those who once seemed unforgettable. That awareness shaped the way he lived away from cameras, where he was far less interested in the spectacle of fame than people expected. While others chased headlines, he preferred routine, evenings that ended early, conversations that were not recorded or repeated. Friends often described him as someone who valued calm over attention, someone who could sit for hours with little more than a television playing softly in the background, content to let silence exist without needing to fill it. It was a contrast that surprised those who only knew the public persona, yet it was also the reason his closest relationships endured for so many years. He did not treat friendship as a performance. He treated it as a responsibility, something steady and dependable in a world that rarely offered stability. Johnny Carson understood that difference better than most. Their connection had never depended on publicity or shared business interests. It grew from mutual respect formed during years when both men were still proving themselves. They had seen each other succeed, fail, recover, and continue, learning along the way that longevity in their profession required more than talent. It required resilience, patience, and the ability to endure long stretches of uncertainty without losing composure. Because of that shared history, Johnny never viewed Dean as merely a famous guest who could boost ratings. He saw him as someone who had carried the same invisible pressures, someone who understood what it meant to stand in front of millions while keeping personal struggles hidden behind a calm expression. By the mid-1980s, however, even those who admired Dean's composure began to notice subtle changes that could not be explained by age alone. He performed less frequently, and when he did appear in public, there was a softness in his energy that had not been there before. The jokes were still delivered with perfect timing, the voice still smooth and familiar, but the spark that once animated every gesture seemed quieter, as though part of his attention had shifted inward. Those who worked with him described a man who remained professional and courteous, yet increasingly private, choosing shorter appearances and declining opportunities he once would have accepted without hesitation. It was not a dramatic withdrawal, but rather a gradual narrowing of the world he allowed himself to occupy. The reasons behind that change were not something he discussed openly. Dean had always believed that personal pain should not become public entertainment, and he maintained that belief even when life tested him in ways few people could fully understand. He carried himself with dignity, rarely complaining, rarely explaining, and never seeking sympathy. For someone who had built a career on making others feel comfortable, admitting vulnerability did not come naturally. Instead, he did what he had always done when faced with difficulty. He showed up, fulfilled his commitments, and returned quietly to the privacy of his home where the world's expectations could no longer reach him. Those closest to him could sense the weight he carried, even when he refused to name it. Conversations became shorter, pauses longer, and moments of reflection more frequent. He still laughed, still shared stories, but there was often a thoughtful distance in his eyes, as though he were measuring each moment against memories that no one else in the room could see. It was not sadness alone that shaped that expression. It was the deeper, more complicated awareness that time changes everything, that even the strongest routines eventually give way to circumstances beyond anyone's control. Johnny, observing from both friendship and professional distance, chose not to press for explanations. He understood that some experiences cannot be hurried into words, and that forcing someone to speak before they are ready only deepens the silence between them. Instead, he did what he had always done when someone he respected was struggling. He remained available without demanding anything in return. Occasional phone calls, brief messages passed through mutual friends, simple reminders that the connection still existed even when months passed without a public appearance. It was a quiet form of support, one that matched Dean's own preference for dignity over display. When news of personal tragedy eventually reached those within their circle, it did not arrive with the noise that often surrounds celebrity stories. It moved more quietly, shared in hushed conversations and private condolences rather than headlines designed to capture attention. For Dean, The loss was not something that could be processed in front of cameras or discussed in carefully edited interviews. It was the kind of grief that reshapes daily life, altering the rhythm of ordinary routines and turning once familiar spaces into reminders of what is no longer there. Friends who visited during that period described a home that felt unchanged on the surface. Same furniture, same photographs, same quiet evenings, but carried an atmosphere that words could not fully explain, a stillness that suggested time had slowed without asking permission. In the months that followed, invitations continued to arrive, as they always did for someone of his stature, yet many went unanswered. It was not rejection, it was exhaustion. The effort required to step back into the public eye, to smile on cue and deliver the version of himself audiences expected, demanded energy he no longer possessed in the same way. Performing had once been a source of joy, a place where music and humor created connection, but now even the thought of that performance required emotional strength that was difficult to summon. It was during this period that Johnny's outreach carried particular meaning. He did not approach Dean with offers designed to revive his career or restore public visibility. Instead, he extended something far simpler and far more valuable, an invitation without pressure. The message was not "come entertain," but "come sit if you want to." That distinction mattered. For someone navigating grief, the difference between expectation and choice can determine whether an invitation feels supportive or overwhelming. When Dean eventually agreed to appear, those who heard the news reacted with a mixture of surprise and concern. Some believed it might be too soon, that returning to a brightly lit stage could reopen wounds still too raw to face publicly. Others sensed that the decision itself might be part of his attempt to reconnect with a world that once felt familiar, a way of testing whether normal conversation could still exist alongside the pain he carried. Dean did not explain his reasons in detail, and no one close to him demanded that he do so. They understood that sometimes the act of showing up is less about readiness and more about hope, the hope that a familiar place might offer a moment of steadiness. In the days leading up to the appearance, the production team prepared as they always did, reviewing notes, selecting music cues, arranging the flow of the show. Yet even among seasoned professionals, there was an unspoken awareness that this segment would not follow the usual rhythm. Instructions were quieter, jokes in the rehearsal space fewer. It was not fear that shaped that atmosphere, but respect, an understanding that the guest walking through those doors carried more than a list of accomplishments. He carried a story still unfolding, one that required sensitivity rather than spectacle. Johnny adjusted his own preparation as well. Normally, he relied on a blend of researched anecdotes and spontaneous humor, trusting his instincts to guide each conversation wherever it naturally led. This time, he reviewed fewer jokes and more memories, shared experiences, moments from earlier years that might provide gentle ground for discussion without forcing anything too personal. He understood that the goal was not to create a memorable television moment, but to create a space where his friend could sit without feeling exposed. As the night approached, Dean maintained his usual outward calm, but those who interacted with him noticed how deliberate his movements had become, how each decision, what suit to wear, what time to arrive, whether to stay for the full segment, was considered carefully rather than casually. It was not hesitation born of fear, but the thoughtful pacing of someone conserving emotional energy, ensuring that whatever strength he had could carry him through the commitment he had chosen to honor. By the time he stepped into the studio that evening, the weight he carried was invisible to viewers who only saw the familiar silhouette beneath the lights. Yet for those who knew him, the difference was unmistakable. The smile was still kind, the voice still steady, but behind both existed a depth shaped by experiences that no audience applause could erase. He was not the carefree entertainer many remembered from earlier decades. He was a man who had lived long enough to understand how fragile joy can be, and how courage sometimes means simply remaining present when absence would feel easier. That was the truth behind why he looked different that night, not because fame had faded or talent had diminished, but because life had added layers that could no longer be hidden behind performance. And as he walked toward the chair across from Johnny Carson, carrying that quiet history with him, the stage became more than a place for entertainment. It became, for a brief and meaningful moment, a space where two old friends could share something far more enduring than laughter, the simple, powerful act of being there for one another when words were no longer enough. The moment the masks fell away, by the time the show returned from its brief commercial pause, The atmosphere inside the studio had settled into a kind of stillness that rarely existed in a place built for entertainment. Usually, those breaks were filled with quick adjustments, light chatter, and the easy confidence of a production that had repeated the same rhythm thousands of times. But on this night, the crew moved with unusual quiet, speaking in softer voices as though instinctively aware that the space had become more fragile than usual. Dean remained seated, his posture composed yet noticeably heavier, while Johnny stayed close, not in the formal distance of a host returning to position, but in the quiet proximity of someone who understood that presence itself could be more comforting than anything said aloud. When the red light signaled that the broadcast had resumed, there was no dramatic shift back into performance. Instead, the moment carried forward exactly as it had been, unpolished, honest, and deeply human. Johnny began again with a gentle tone, choosing his words carefully, not as a man searching for the next laugh line, but as someone navigating a conversation where respect mattered more than timing. He spoke about the long road both of them had traveled through television's changing landscape, recalling early days when neither of them knew whether their careers would last more than a few seasons. The memory drew a faint, sincere smile from Dean, the kind that appeared not from habit but from recognition, as though he were briefly transported to a time when the world felt simpler and the future still stretched wide with possibility. That smile lingered only a moment before settling back into quiet reflection, yet it changed the mood of the room just enough to remind everyone watching that the warmth people loved had not disappeared. It had simply become quieter, layered beneath experiences that could not be undone. As the conversation unfolded, Johnny resisted the instinct that had defined his career, the instinct to steer every exchange toward humor or resolution. Instead, he allowed pauses to exist, letting silence become part of the dialogue rather than something to be avoided. In that silence, Dean seemed to gather his thoughts with visible care, answering questions not with rehearsed stories, but with short, thoughtful reflections about time, about how success once felt urgent and now felt distant, about how the things that mattered most were rarely the ones discussed in interviews. His voice carried no bitterness, only a calm acceptance shaped by years of learning that fame cannot shield anyone from life's deeper realities. The audience sensed the shift as well. People who had arrived expecting laughter now sat motionless, their attention focused not on entertainment, but on the quiet exchange between two men who had spent decades living in public yet were now sharing something unmistakably private. There were no restless movements, no scattered coughs or whispered side comments, only a collective stillness that made even the hum of studio equipment seem unusually loud. It was as though everyone present understood that they were witnessing something rare for television, a moment where authenticity replaced performance without anyone announcing the change. Johnny, watching Dean closely, asked a question that was simple in wording but heavy in meaning, something about how it felt to step back into familiar places after so much time away. The question was not intrusive, yet it opened a space that could not be filled with a casual answer. Dean looked down briefly, his hands resting together as though grounding himself before speaking. When he finally responded, his words were measured and soft, explaining that sometimes returning to familiar rooms could feel comforting and painful at the same time, because memories do not remain in the past. They travel with you, waiting quietly until something brings them forward again. There was no dramatic emphasis in his voice, only honesty delivered without decoration. Johnny nodded, his expression reflecting not curiosity but understanding. He did not interrupt or redirect. Instead, he allowed that thought to settle in the room, giving it the weight it deserved. For someone known for filling space with wit, that restraint revealed more about his character than any joke ever could. It showed that beneath the polished professionalism was a man capable of recognizing when humor would only distract from something more important. As the minutes passed, the conversation drifted naturally toward reflections on friendship, on the unusual bond formed between people who share the strange experience of living before cameras night after night. Dean spoke quietly about how rare it was to find connections that remained steady even when careers changed direction, noting that genuine friendship was less about constant contact and more about knowing someone would still answer the phone years later without explanation. Johnny listened without adding commentary, his usual host's cadence replaced by the attentive posture of someone receiving rather than guiding. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when Dean's composure wavered. It was not a dramatic break, not something designed for effect, but a subtle tightening of his expression, the kind that appears when a thought carries more emotion than expected. He paused, looking toward the floor before lifting his gaze again, and in that instant the carefully maintained public persona seemed to fade just enough for the audience to glimpse the man behind it. It was not weakness. It was the visible effort of someone choosing to remain present despite the weight pressing against him. Johnny responded not with words but with a simple gesture, leaning slightly forward and resting his hand gently on the edge of the desk, a posture that conveyed support without drawing attention to itself. That small movement communicated more clearly than any sentence that the conversation was no longer about television. It was about two people sharing space during a difficult moment. The cameras continued to record, yet the presence of millions of viewers seemed irrelevant compared to the immediate reality of that exchange. In that shared quiet, the audience began to understand why Dean appeared different that night. It was not age alone, nor fatigue, nor the natural slowing that comes with time. It was the visible imprint of experiences that had reshaped his perspective, softening the carefree image into something deeper and more reflective. The charm that once flowed effortlessly was still present, but it now coexisted with a seriousness that made every word feel more intentional. Rather than diminishing him, that change revealed a strength that had always existed beneath the surface. The strength required to continue showing up even when the world felt heavier than before. Johnny eventually spoke again, his voice lower than usual, acknowledging not any specific event, but the universal truth that life can alter even the strongest routines without warning. He mentioned how people often assume entertainers live untouched by hardship simply because they appear confident on stage. Yet the reality is that no amount of applause can prevent personal struggles. His words were not directed at Dean alone. They were an invitation for the audience to recognize the shared humanity between themselves and the man sitting across from him. Dean responded with a small nod, the kind that carries agreement without needing elaboration. He added quietly that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is continue moving forward even when they no longer feel certain about the path ahead. The statement was simple, almost understated, yet it resonated through the room with surprising force because it was spoken without performance. It was not advice offered from a stage persona. It was a reflection shaped by lived experience. The band, sensing the tone, remained silent, their instruments resting untouched. Even the studio lights seemed less harsh now, as though the intensity of the earlier segments had softened in response to the emotional gravity of the moment. Time felt slower, not in a way that dragged, but in a way that allowed each exchange to settle fully before the next began. No one appeared eager to rush toward the end of the segment, even though the structure of live television demanded it. As the conversation approached its natural close, Johnny thanked Dean again, not with the usual upbeat energy of a host wrapping a segment, but with the sincerity of someone expressing genuine appreciation. He spoke about the importance of presence, about how simply being willing to sit and talk carried more meaning than any prepared story. Dean accepted the acknowledgement with humility, offering a quiet smile that suggested gratitude without needing to articulate it. When they stood, the audience rose with them, applause filling the room in a steady, respectful wave. It was not the loud, celebratory ovation reserved for a dazzling performance. It was something warmer and more grounded, an expression of recognition for the honesty that had just unfolded. Dean paused briefly, looking out across the crowd, and for a moment his expression softened in a way that hinted at relief, not because the segment had ended, but because he had managed to remain present through it. Johnny walked with him a few steps toward the edge of the stage, their conversation continuing in low voices unheard by microphones. Whatever was said in that private exchange remained between them, yet the gesture itself spoke clearly enough. It was not about showmanship or spectacle. It was about ensuring that a friend did not have to leave alone. As Dean disappeared beyond the curtain, the studio held its silence for a heartbeat longer before the routine of production resumed. The next segment would begin, the band would play again, and the familiar rhythm of late-night television would return. Yet something within that room had changed in a way that could not be reset by music or applause. For everyone present, and for those watching from their homes, that night became less about entertainment and more about recognition. Recognition that even the most polished public figures carry private histories. Recognition that dignity sometimes appears not in grand speeches, but in the quiet decision to show up despite pain. And recognition that friendship, when genuine, does not require dramatic declarations to be felt. Long after the cameras moved on to other guests and other jokes, the memory of that conversation lingered, not because of anything sensational, but because it revealed a truth rarely visible on television. Behind every legendary image is a human life shaped by love, loss, resilience, and the ongoing effort to keep moving forward when the world no longer feels as simple as it once did. The quiet legacy that remained. After the applause faded and the next segment of the show carried the audience back toward familiar laughter, the moment that had just unfolded did not disappear as television moments usually do. Instead, it lingered in the air like a memory that refused to settle, quietly reshaping how everyone present understood what they had witnessed. For the crew, who were accustomed to moving quickly from one cue to the next, there was an unusual stillness even as they resumed their duties, as if each person needed an extra second to return to routine. For the audience, the experience was less like watching a program and more like being present during something deeply personal, something that could not be reduced to entertainment. And for Johnny, sitting once again behind the desk that had been his professional anchor for decades, the conversation had shifted something inside him that no amount of experience could fully prepare him for. In the years that followed, the public would continue to remember Dean Martin through the images that had defined his career. The smooth voice, the relaxed humor, the effortless charisma that had once filled concert halls and living rooms across the country. Those memories did not vanish, nor should they have, because they represented the joy he had given to millions. Yet for those who had seen that quieter night, another image existed alongside the familiar one. The image of a man who carried himself with grace, even when life had stripped away the illusion that everything could be handled with a smile. That contrast did not diminish his legacy. It deepened it, revealing that the warmth people loved was not an act, but a choice he continued to make even when circumstances made it difficult. Dean gradually stepped further away from public appearances, not with any dramatic announcement, but through the natural narrowing that happens when someone begins to value peace more than visibility. He spent more time in the comfort of familiar surroundings, choosing evenings that required no performance and mornings that arrived without schedules. Friends who visited during those later years often described a man who remained courteous and kind, still capable of quiet humor, yet increasingly protective of his privacy. The world outside continued at its usual pace, new stars rising, new shows capturing attention. But within his home, time seemed to move differently, guided less by ambition and more by reflection. Johnny, true to the quiet loyalty that had always defined their friendship, maintained contact without expectation. Their conversations were not about returning to television or reviving past routines. They were simple check-ins, brief exchanges that carried reassurance rather than pressure. Sometimes they spoke about old colleagues, sometimes about music, sometimes about nothing in particular. The purpose was not to solve anything or change anything, but simply to remind each other that the connection built over years had not been erased by distance or circumstance. In a profession where relationships often fade as quickly as ratings change, that steady presence became one of the most meaningful forms of support either man could offer. As time moved forward, stories from that night quietly circulated among those who had been present, not as gossip, but as a reminder that even the most controlled environments can become spaces for genuine emotion. Crew members would occasionally recall how the studio had felt unusually still, how the usual cues seemed secondary to the human moment unfolding at the desk. Audience members who had been there would later describe the experience not as witnessing a dramatic event, but as sensing a shift in understanding, a realization that fame does not shield anyone from life's deeper truths. These recollections were shared respectfully, often in tones that suggested gratitude rather than curiosity, because what they had seen was not spectacle but sincerity. When Dean eventually passed away years later, tributes focused naturally on his remarkable career, the music and performances that had defined an era. Yet among those who knew him personally, and among viewers who remembered that quieter television appearance, another aspect of his life remained just as important. They remembered the dignity with which he carried himself during difficult seasons, the way he chose presence over pretense, and the humility that allowed him to step back when continuing to perform would have required more emotional energy than he wished to spend. In that sense, his final chapter was not defined by absence, but by intention, the deliberate decision to live more privately rather than remain constantly in the spotlight. Johnny attended the farewell quietly, avoiding attention in the same way he had always respected Dean's preference for discretion. He did not seek interviews or attempt to turn the moment into a public narrative. Instead, he honored his friend in the manner that had defined their relationship from the beginning, without spectacle, without performance, and without the need to explain what did not belong to the public. Those who saw him there later spoke of his reserved demeanor, noting that the composure he had maintained throughout his career remained intact, yet carried a visible softness that revealed how deeply the loss was felt. Years later, when conversations about memorable interviews surfaced, that evening was occasionally mentioned not because of anything sensational, but because it represented something rare in broadcast history, a moment when authenticity was allowed to exist without being edited into a storyline. Johnny reflected on how the experience had reminded him that the role of a host was not only to entertain, but sometimes to listen, to recognize when a guest needed space rather than questions. It was a lesson that extended beyond television, touching on the broader truth that empathy often requires silence more than speech. Looking back, what made that night unforgettable was not a dramatic confession or a shocking revelation, but the simple honesty shared between two men who had spent much of their lives protecting their emotions behind professional composure. The difference in Dean's appearance, the quieter smile, the slower movements, the thoughtful pauses, was not a sign of decline, but evidence of a life lived fully enough to carry both joy and sorrow with equal sincerity. He did not attempt to hide that change, and in doing so, he allowed viewers to see that strength can exist alongside vulnerability without contradiction. For audiences who later revisited that memory, the story became less about celebrity and more about recognition. Recognition that everyone, regardless of success or status, eventually faces moments that reshape how they see the world. Recognition that friendship is often expressed through presence rather than solutions. And recognition that dignity is not defined by how confidently someone performs during easy times, but by how gently they carry themselves when life becomes difficult. In the end, the reason Dean Martin looked different that night was not something that could be captured fully by cameras or explained through a single moment. It was the visible reflection of years of experience, love, loss, and resilience layered quietly beneath a familiar face. What viewers witnessed was not the fading of a legend, but the revealing of the person who had always existed behind the legend. A man who continued to show kindness, professionalism, and grace even when the world felt heavier than before. That is why the memory endured, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. Not because it changed history, but because it reminded people watching, whether in the studio or from their living rooms, that it is possible to face life's hardest seasons without losing one's humanity. And long after the lights dimmed and the stage returned to its usual rhythm of laughter and applause, the quiet truth of that evening remained, carried forward in the stories people shared about two friends who, for a brief and meaningful moment, allowed the world to see that behind every public smile is a private heart still learning how to keep going.